couple of things I want to tell you before we get started with this panel. I'm very happy to have on the stage with me from the end going toward me is Gwen Howard, the Executive Director of the Mississippi Economic Development Council, John McKay, who's President and CEO of the Mississippi Manufacturers Association, and Derek Easley, the President and CEO of the BIPEC, which is the Business and Industry Political Education Committee. I talk regularly with all three of these to talk about what are key things happening at the legislature. Because what we learned a couple of years ago is partnerships matter. And it started really with a piece of legislation called the COVID Liability Business Protection Act. And it was an act that was going to make sure that we were protected from claims on COVID that there was no way to prove where it happened. And businesses did not need to be a target. And what we realized is by working together, we could accomplish a great piece of legislation. And I think what we got passed that year was probably the strongest and most recognized piece of legislation in the country. And it was a result of not only the partnership that we created among us, but it was also building a coalition of other organizations that made it happen. And I think that's why having these guys on stage with me right now, I'm extremely excited about this conversation to wrap up our session this morning, simply because as we look at this, working together allows us to accomplish a lot of great things. And, you know, there are a lot of things on the table each legislative session. And I'm going to start with one that we've all been involved in, and other people in the room have been equally involved in, and that's the internet-based software and remote software sales tax issue. About a little over a year ago, our Department of Revenue decided that they were going to start putting sales tax on this, and it created a lot of problems. And Derek, you've kind of been at the tip of the spear, if you will, on this issue. Can you kind of give us an overview of what this really is and why everybody in this room needs to understand it's important?
Sure. Thank you all for letting me be a part of this panel. I'm happy to kind of give the background on the issue, kind of how we got to where we are. Then I guess we can all kind of talk about what we learned over the past 16 months on this issue and why it's important for everybody in this room that we fix it. In September of 2021, the Department of Revenue amended an existing regulation that deals with computer equipment, software and sales. The amendments would have pretty significantly increased taxes on pretty much everybody in this room. We weighed in with DOR, we attended a hearing, we voiced our concerns, we raised enough questions that the Department of Revenue kind of pumped their brakes until we could get more input and answers. And this was in October of 2021, so we were right around the corner for the 2022 legislative session. So what we decided to do is introduce legislation that would essentially codify what we thought the existing rules were. And we kind of went back and forth with the Department of Revenue. Ultimately, that ended up in a study committee, which I ended up chairing, which is exactly how I wanted to spend my summer.
But you had so much fun.
Right. The Department of Revenue agreed to rescind their proposed regulation and wait on the study committee's recommendation to the legislature this year. That hasn't exactly been the case. They did rescind the regulation, but I still think, John could talk about this in a minute, I still think they're collecting taxes on this issue. So the committee, we conducted 9 meetings throughout the summer and early fall, and we don't have time to really go through exactly all of the findings of the committee. If you have trouble sleeping tonight, it's on our website. It's about 300 pages. This is one of the rare study committees that the legislature commissioned that actually went out and did the work. But long story short is, bottom line is that this is a very complicated tax issue that all the states are dealing with. And we saw an opportunity to put Mississippi at a competitive advantage on this complicated issue. So our recommendation to the legislature this year is that Mississippi should eliminate sales tax on all software and related services when used as a business input. And that's kind of the background of how we got to where we are. And John, you may have some real life examples of how this affects your members.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess first and foremost, I just want to say I'm blessed to be up here representing manufacturers. We have a very manufacturing-intensive state, and I couldn't be more pleased to sort of be their voice in this conversation. And Derek's absolutely right. One of the more complicating factors of this whole thing is not only did the Department of Revenue try to amend their current regulations, but in fact, what ended up happening is they rescinded those proposed changes, after we had some conversations. But unfortunately, what they had done in the previous, 1 to 2 years before the attempted change was they were issuing individual letters to companies, to vendors that sell this software and these services to companies, and told those vendors to start collecting a tax. Now, the regulation is very clear. It's in black and white. Anybody can go read it. That's against the regulation. So what ended up happening is they were doing something that was against the stated regulation, and we called them on it, but in order for us to kind of move the ball forward, we would have to undo everything they've already done. And so that really leads to what Derek described, and us taking a step back and really looking at, well, if we were going to start this from scratch, what should the policy of Mississippi be? Let's get the legislature to weigh in on this and really devote some time to thinking, how can we promote this as an economic development tool, an incentive to let companies, especially high-tech, intensive companies that use this type of software, that invest millions of dollars. I mean, just for one example, in the defense sector, a lot of defense contractors, in order to do business with the Department of Defense, you're required to have very, very high-end cybersecurity software. It's just a requirement, and you have to invest that capital. So if we're gonna, whether it's a federal requirement or whether it's just part of you doing business, we wanna make sure that you really get the advantage of not having to pay that sales tax. And really, for manufacturing, as most of you all know, manufacturing is a very high-tech sector. There are very few manufacturers these days that look like they did 40 years ago, and all of that change is driven by software. So as we move forward, again, we want to treat this as a major business input and almost like a raw material. You can't do the job. I mean, a robot in a factory cannot function without that software. So we really want to look at that and kind of be bold and step out there as a state and have this policy in place to really stand out amongst the states and attract those companies to Mississippi.
And you talked about the committee actually doing the work. John Fletcher, who was working with the committee, he's also on our board of governors, talked to our board yesterday. He brought the report with him. It's about this thick. He offered it out if anyone wanted. I don't think anybody took him up on that offer, but so the work is done. So what's the next step? I mean,
well, the next step is we have crafted legislation. We have met with leadership, House, Senate, and the governor's office to explain our position on this issue. I will say, especially on the House and Senate side and in the governor's office, they understand that this is something that needs to be addressed. So I think John and Kelly Wright, who works with John, met with Senator Harkins yesterday to walk through the issue. I know Clark Wise, who represents the realtors, has met with Chairman Lamar on the House side. So our goal is to get this legislation moving and, again, provide certainty in a very complicated issue. And, again, I never thought I'd be even somewhat of an expert on software and software tax issues. But one example that kept coming up that I've used anytime I've talked to different groups, I see Mr. Taylor sitting here in the front. He asked a specific question at one of our meetings. He said, what if there's a natural disaster that comes through Louisville and disrupts my operation, which happened? And I have spent the money in Kentucky for redundancies so that if this were to happen again, I can flip a switch and put everything back online at Taylor Machineries. According to the Department of Revenue, when he flips that switch, that becomes a taxable event in the state of Mississippi. That's just one example of what we're trying to prevent. But to answer your question further, Scott, the legislation has been introduced. We don't have a bill number yet. There's usually a backlog at this time at the beginning of the session. But our goal is to get both pieces of legislation moving, and hopefully one of them will make it across the finish line.
Well, that's true. I mean, you heard Jason mention there's already 200 in the first day on the House side of bills introduced. So we got a lot of things to wade through there. Gwen, I want to go to you real quick and talk a little bit about economic development. And last year one of the priorities was getting MFLEX, our incentive plan for flexible tax incentives, passed. Why was it so important to do that, and why must we continue to look at ways to improve that as we go forward?
Well, first, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here and to get to bring economic development to a part of this conversation. And I just want to commend y'all for our partnership and being able to continue to address barriers that are in the way to be a business-friendly climate, as well as identifying areas that we can be competitive. MFLEX was one of those, and Scott, as you know from the 2014 competitiveness study that we partnered together to do, we looked at several different areas that we could improve on in the state and take advantage of, and our incentives were one of those. That is just one piece of the recruitment tool. And they looked at our incentives and shared that we have some great incentives in place, but they really need to be streamlined. At that time, they were compartmentalized, and it was very hard to actually access and utilize those the way they were intended. So with our local economic developers that really spearheaded this initiative over the past 5 years, that we were able to get that legislation produced that we now know as MFLEX, and with the support of Lieutenant Governor Hosemann, the Senate and the House, we now are able to celebrate MFLEX and have that as a tool in our box. But it really was a game changer for economic development, recruitment, and retention. But as we continue to look at it, we have to acknowledge that Mississippi is successful with economic development because we don't let these tools get stagnant and outdated. We're continuously looking at how they measure up against our competition, our neighboring states. And so we have to do that with MFLEX as well. It was intended to be here as a tool, and so as things change and our competition sees what we have available and they look at that, we have to make sure that MFLEX is addressed as well.
Well, thank you for. I mean, again, that was something that I think we all saw as needed. Part of us being successful is having a strong tax structure, having the ability to have incentives. But John, you and I both serve on the Emergency Road and Bridge Repair Fund Advisory Committee, and what we've seen is almost $5 million have been put into local roads and bridges over the last 500 million. Thank you.
Yeah.
500 million. I had to, 5 wouldn't do a whole lot with it.
That's right.
But we're to continue to focus. Why is this so important, particularly from a manufacturing perspective, for roads to be really up to what they need to be?
Absolutely. And I appreciate that question, Scott. And I saw our fearless chairman, Mike McCormick, with Farm Bureau here earlier. And he's done a great job, along with the entire makeup of that advisory group. And again, I want to highlight, this is another, you heard the panel up here earlier talking about it, this is another example of collaboration. So we were able to put in the initial piece of funding, that bonded project a few years ago, this advisory group, and it's a cross-section of business and industry and ag interests and local governments and all these folks that understand the need. And so certainly for manufacturers, you could imagine that in order to get raw material and component parts into the facility is incredibly important, as well as getting the raw material out. And so with this program, at the time that this was instituted, we were having, I think it was well over 100 bridges were posted either closed or reduced weight, which made them non-functional. So trucks were having to go out of the way, all the deliveries were delayed. It was really a problem. And a lot of it was isolated on those local systems. And those local systems, quite frankly, just didn't have the funding available to address the problem. So by putting thanks to the legislature and the leadership over there, they were able to put this money in place, and through this advisory council and the great leadership at MDOT, I want to commend them, and certainly Brad White's over there now and is doing a fantastic job with that team. They brought the technical expertise to the table. We brought our economic development lens to the table, and through a pretty complicated formula, able to really dole out those projects to the highest and best use. I mean, certainly we want industry to flourish, we want our ag sector to flourish, we want, just everyday commuters, school buses, all of these things. I mean, safety and economic growth and development are the keys here. And again, I think it's that partnership and that collaboration that really makes it happen.
And I think it's key for us to continue to push for that type of funding as we go forward. And Gwen, highways, they matter from an economic development standpoint as well. I mean, site selectors will tell you that, correct?
Highways and all of our infrastructure, it is a pertinent factor when they are looking at sites for their clients. They're going to identify that site, but then Governor Reeves talked about this earlier, speed to market. As soon as they're looking for a site, they are looking to solve problems that happened 2 years ago. So speed to market is more important than it ever has been. And so when they look at that, they're looking at how are they going to get their products and their materials into that site and then get that end product distributed quickly. So highways are a huge piece of that site selection process. But you can't talk about highways without talking about the piece we already mentioned, which is sites. If I was a motivational speaker, I would do what Laura tells me in every email and say, sites, sites, sites. It is what we are preaching right now. They're not going to look at our highways if we don't have a product. So we have to continue through our utilities and our legislature that has been so supportive of this. We have to continue to grow that site program that's administered through MDA.
Well, thank you so much for mentioning that, because, we heard the governor talk about it this morning. We know it is really important. Now, the one thing we haven't touched on, every 4 years, when it's an election year, all we hear, the legislature's not going to do much because it's election year. That never seems to be the case. Derek, tell us a little bit about what you're hearing and kind of what might be ahead for us as we look at elections as we head into this year.
Sure. Well, you do hear that every 4 years. It's an election year, not a whole lot's going to get done. It usually doesn't work out. Usually there's quite a bit of activity. In my opinion, as long as they just take care of our software bill, they can go home. But yes, it is an election year, and the first thing to note, there's currently 2 open seats in the House. Jim Beckett from Bruce was appointed by the governor to the public utilities staff, so that special election is actually next Tuesday. Representative Deborah Gibbs from here in Jackson, she won an election to become a circuit judge, so I don't think the governor's called that special election date yet. So we're starting off, we've got 2 open seats before we even get into the election year. As far as the 2023 regular elections, there's at least 12 confirmed open House seats. I think there could be more. I would note that this includes 2 new seats that are a result of the census and redistricting. In the Senate right now, I think the only incumbent senator who's announced that he's not running for re-election is Senator Chris Kaufman. But there are 2 new seats in the Senate as well as a result of redistricting. And there is 1 incumbent running for one of the new seats. So for comparison, as of now, these numbers are down compared to 4 year ago. There's quite a bit of turnover. In 2019, there were 12 open seats in the Senate as compared to 1 right now, and 16 in the House, which compared to 12. So it appears there's always going to be some surprises. The qualifying deadline is at the end of this month, and I expect those numbers to go up, but it's an exciting time for BIPAC. A lot of folks ask about who is BIPAC, what do y'all do? And I was like, in an election year when you go to the mailbox and you're like, man, I'm tired of all this direct mail. Sorry, that's us. But we're doing it for a good reason. We're trying to elect men and women who appreciate what folks in this room do and pass laws that help our economy grow. So I'm proud to represent BIPAC in that capacity and trying to accomplish those goals.
Well, there's probably a couple of more things other than just the tax bill that we need to address, but that is very important without question. So we'll be here a little longer, but we've got about 2 minutes left. I want to just do a little quick rapid fire, just a real quick answer. and I'll start with you, Gwen, workforce, the importance as it relates to economic development.
Well, I will start by saying I think it's unfair to put workforce under rapid fire, but I'll give it the best shot. So, workforce development, I will just leave y'all with this. Site selectors, when they're looking, they're going to ask about what your workforce is, what that pipeline is. I heard from our friend George Freeland in Jackson County recently, and he said if you're talking about economic development, you have to have workforce development at the center of that conversation. And so if we want to win at economic development, we have to win at workforce development. So, I want to commend Accelerate for getting career coaches into 125 of our schools this past year. They're a very young organization, and they are really going leaps and bounds to make sure that we meet those goals and can win in workforce and economic development.
John, healthcare as it relates to business and industry.
Certainly healthcare is a major issue and concern, and you're going to see the legislature and political leaders discuss and debate and pass legislation this year on healthcare, and it's such a broad and complicated topic. But I will just say that we do an occasional survey with our membership, and as you might expect, workforce and finding qualified employees is always number one, and it is in our last survey. But surprisingly, the cost of health care for our membership rose to the second most concerning issue for them. And as I'm sure all of you have seen with your own businesses and even personally, the cost of insurance and certainly providing that insurance to your employees is continually rising. And then this isn't a new phenomenon, but it seems to be more acute now, and that's something that we want to address. And look, we have partners across the board, whether it's insurance companies, whether it's the provider networks. All of those things are very important, and we want to be a partner to all of them. But at the end of the day, especially in the manufacturing sector, which provides the highest level of benefits probably of any sector in the state, we want to be very aware that those cost pressures are very real. And there's really only two ways to address them if they keep going up. The employer has to absorb those costs, which then goes into that bottom line. Either they've got to increase the cost of their goods or they have to absorb it. Or they have to pass that on to the employees, which again could potentially make it unaffordable for those folks. So it's a very, very important issue, and it's something that we're going to keep our eye on and again try to work with legislative leaders on ways to bring those cost pressures down for everybody across the board, but certainly for employers that provide those benefits to their employees.
Initiative referendum. Derek, is it going to happen this year?
I don't know. We'll see. Of course, in 2021, our Supreme Court had a decision that essentially did away with the ballot initiative process in Mississippi. In last year's legislative session, there were bills introduced, there were negotiations. Ultimately, the House and Senate just couldn't agree on a final product. I will say, I think one thing that they do agree on is that whatever ultimately passes the legislature, that the ballot initiative should be an opportunity to change existing statute or add statute, not the Constitution, which I think is a good thing. If the legislature can come to an agreement this year, then it could actually be on the ballot in November for the public to decide, to approve whatever agreement they come up with. If that were to happen, then in 2024 would actually be the first opportunity for a group who would like to put something on the ballot following whatever the new rules are. That'd be the first opportunity, would be 2024, if the legislature were to act this year.
And I'm going to take the last one. It's student financial aid. We've been doing a lot of work looking at this, and I will tell you there's proposals on the table to increase the amount of state aid, but really focusing on non-traditional part-time students, which we believe is going to help us, particularly in the career technical industry training sector, and it's something that we're going to be paying close attention to as we go forward. So we've covered a lot of topics today with this group, and I think as we go through the rest of this legislative session, I think we'll all be sending out information to our members, and many of you are members of multiple organizations that are represented here, and we just appreciate y'all being interested in these issues and helping us really move them forward as we go into the session. So again, thanks to each of you for being with us this morning. And I really appreciate the partnership that we've developed, and we are going to continue to work to make great things happen for our state as we go forward. So thank y'all so much.
Thanks, Scott.